Hello.
Thanks, Acting President. I rise today to speak about the Education and Training Protection of School Communities Bill 2021. Once upon a time, I was a school teacher. In fact, my very first job was in Blackstone, a remote Aboriginal community in the central desert of Western Australia. And to say it was an eye-opener is a massive understatement. My accommodation at the time was a small caravan at the back of the school. I had to run a power extension and phone extension from the school to under the school, actually, to my caravan, as there was absolutely nothing. A small gas stove allowed me to cook, but as a young 20-odd-year-old, well, I took my life in my own hands and tended to stick to the reliable staples of toasties and baked beans. The communities were alcohol-free, and you may be surprised, but this was a challenge for me. The closest pub was around 6 hours away in Uluru. And yes, there were times, many times on a Friday afternoon after a hard week of teaching, that the drive was well worth it. My teaching also took me to other remote communities in Warburton and finally Chicali, where I was fortunate enough to be principal of that school. I often look back at those times and still can't believe it. It's a different world and one that I had absolutely no idea about. I've often said of my time in the desert that the students, the parents and the elders taught me more about life, in particular the Indigenous way of life, than I ever taught them in the classroom. It was a privilege and something that I'm forever grateful for. I love that job. In fact, it was more than just a job. Teaching is one of the most underrated professions going around. The importance of a teacher upon a child's life cannot be underestimated. And now to the bill before us in this place. In Victoria, we've had decades of surveys that tell us that principals and teachers are disproportionately being abused, threatened and intimidated by parents. In my time as a teacher, I too was subjected to the threats and assaults from parents. Fortunately, my gift of the gab back then, I was able to diffuse those situations quite early on in the piece and escaped with any injury. Other educators have not been so lucky. It's quite sad, really, because teachers have an incredible responsibility, and for the most part, they do everything in their power to make sure that each and every child gets a well-rounded education. They don't get paid enough, and they have to do hours of overtime that isn't recognised in their pay packet. In fact, information has just come out on this exact issue, actually, saying that our state school teachers work about 15 hours of unpaid overtime every week. This is simply astounding. And I can confirm that, as my wife even, Mandy, in her early stages of her teaching career, currently at Northern Bay College in Corio, works incredibly long hours well past the school bell and quite often into weekends. She has already seen her fair share of volatile situations involving parents and schools. It is a thankless job. In relation to this bill, it stems from a recommendation by the Protective Schools Ministerial Task Force commissioned by the Education Minister. Consulted over 500 people, including parents, teachers, support staff and students. And its purpose was to provide advice to the Minister on how to prevent and reduce violence and aggressions in schools. I think this was a great initiative and I commend the government for allowing the task force to consult widely. I have heard, though, that after this report was handed down, the consultation on what these recommendations might look like in legislation didn't happen, and this is a bit disappointing. I will raise some concerns in a moment regarding the limited scope of this bill to deal with aggressive behaviour. Darren Hinch's Justice Party supports the two types of school safety orders that will be in place following the bill's passage. And whilst we very much hope that regulations mandate mediation and non-punitive actions before these orders are taken out where possible, we know that in some instances they are necessary. Our teachers deserve to be safe at work. I'd also like to state on the record that should acts of serious verbal or physical violence occur, including threats to kill or similar, that Victoria Police should continue to be the default organisation contacted. There may now be a duplicated process with an order being taken out, but we do need to take these acts of violence very seriously. I don't think serious acts of violence should be dealt with by an Education Department bureaucrat, and I would think that the government would very much agree. Our concern also relates to the disadvantage to the child as a result of one of these orders. The child's safety and any disadvantage that may experience from an immediate or ongoing school community safety order should be absolutely considered. And I have two main queries in relation to this bill, and I hope the government might address either in the committee stage or in their summing up in response. Firstly, I'd like to know what the threshold is to activate either a community safety order is, how many Facebook comments or messages might constitute an action, for instance? What sort of verbal misconduct might constitute an action? We had a situation raised with us where culture played a part in the parent not realising that their loud speaking was being taken as abusive. Secondly, I'd also like to know what sort of mediation or conversations need to take place before one of these orders are taken out. Obviously, an immediate school community safety order would be needed in the immediacy of a situation, but does the school need to prove that it's tried to repair the relationship with the parent through dispute resolution or similar? I feel that this is an integral to ensuring the ongoing relationship between the parent and the school. I'd like to thank Parents Victoria for meeting with our staff to share their concerns. Now, whilst we will be supporting the bill, we'd like to reiterate our message to the government that if we're trying to fix problems of aggression and bullying or harassment between parent and teacher, we need to also look at the reasons for this behaviour to fix the problem. Banning parents from school grounds may be necessary to keep teachers safe from harm, but we need to explore these options of mediation to fix the actual problem. I hope the government keeps this in mind when developing regulations for this bill when it's passed. The Greens amendments in this space go some way in addressing this issue and something of which we are looking at supporting. One last thing I'd like to mention before concluding my contribution is in relation to EduSafe forms, which I've been alerted to. This bill talks to the issue of parent-to-school violence, but ignores a very real problem of children-to-school violence. The problems are very much interrelated. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. A child's behaviour is often learned through the environment in which they are raised. Parents and other adults act as role models, and children replicate the behaviour that they are immersed in, and that is a well-known fact. According to the Education Department website, EduSafe forms allow, and I quote, all department employees to report incidents, injuries and hazards themselves or on behalf of other employees if they are not able to, unquote. When lodged, the reports go to the person's direct supervisor for action. But it's interesting because I've spoken to some teachers who only just found out that EduSafe exists. I've heard of incidents such as students approaching support staff with knives in home economics, and no EduSafe forms were completed because the staff weren't aware of the threshold to which they should report. And on that note, it sounds to me like each school sets its own thresholds. So you could have some schools reporting each time a teacher is verbally abused, and other schools that virtually never report at all. Lastly, these forms take quite a long time to fill out. So some teachers and support staff are discouraged from lodging a report, even if the behaviour is undoubtedly reportable. Some teachers have told me that it can take up to 45 minutes to fill out a form. Given that statistic, I mentioned earlier about teachers working 12 hours unpaid overtime a week on average, it's no wonder that they don't have time to fill out these forms. Raising the issue of children emulating adult behaviour is so important to this bill. It raises a very possible unintended consequence of the bill, and that is when you ban a parent from the school, it may become an excuse for the child to disengage or worse, to not show up. I wonder about the practical implications, such as if a parent has an order taken out against them and their child doesn't turn up, is the parent notified? And if so, how? These are the things we need to think about. The children most at risk not showing up at school are the ones that need to be there the most. And as you'll catch me saying quite a bit this week, no doubt, we regularly ask ourselves, who is looking after the children? I feel that this is a consideration that potentially got a little bit lost in the drafting of the bill. So in summary, Darren Hedges Justice Party will support this bill. We have some concerns that mediation and dispute resolution hasn't been mentioned as part of the formal process, and so I would recommend that this be explored in the implementation of the bill. Further, I would seek answers to my two queries, as mentioned previously, from the government, if possible. Otherwise, we commend this bill to the House.